I joined the Army. I enlisted straight out 2 months after I graduated high school. I was 17 years old in the fall of 1976. And I wanted to be a journalist, a military journalist. My first assignment was a year in Korea. And then I went to some weird job in the Pentagon handling public requests for official Army photographs. The Army Photo Library was on the 5th floor of the Pentagon. And my job was to handle public requests for official photos, from cartoon novels to little kids asking for pictures of text. How that got classified as a journalist, as a writer job, I wasted 2 years doing that when I really be out doing reporting. So they came from give me my re-enlistment spiel for my first re-enlistment. I just was going to get out and go back to college on the Vietnam era GI Bill. I had to shoot the moon. I said, well, the only way I'll re-enlist is if you send me to Stars and Stripes in Europe. And they hemmed and hawed, oh, we don't know if we can do that. And I certainly didn't have the experience. I didn't expect to get it. But they came back and said, okay, we got you a slot in Europe. So I re-upped, went over there in the fall of 1980, when the headquarters was still in Griesheim, just outside of Darmstadt. So that's when I first got there.
So you started in Griesheim and then you moved to Munich, or tell me kind of where you went.
Yeah. My first 3 years were at the headquarters in Griesheim. In those days, every military newbie had to put a few months of menial duty in the letters to the Admiral, Kathy Chipman, who later became Kathy Chipman Wicker, wife of the legendary Bob Wicker, sorting letters from the readers. So then finally, towards the end of 1980, I finally got assigned to an actual reporting job. My first story was published in December. It was a feature on a German blade museum, all kinds of historic swords and rapiers and all kinds of bladed instruments. And the photographer I pulled was the legendary Gus Schutler, and it was quite a drive. So I got to listen to some of his famous tales. So needless to say, I was quite dazzled by that. And my initial formal beat assignment was in the Würzburg area, covering the anchored by the 3rd Infantry Division. And I later shifted to the Frankfurt, revolving around the 3rd Armored Division. And obviously, with those two kinds of units, covering those units, I did a lot of stuff out in the field, training and maneuvers. Getting mud with the troops was a lot of fun because I just got to get muddy and play in the mud. They had to actually train in it, so it was a little bit more fun for me. But I also got to do some significant news stories. My first really big story was in the summer of 1981. I got to cover General Bernard Rogers, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, as he was opening the 1981 Autumn Forge War, the big annual war games where we chest thumped against the Warsaw Pact, show them that we were ready to go if they wanted to. Then in my 3rd year, the honchos began talking about establishing a new bureau down in Munich with plans to cover, for that beat, to cover the armed forces recreation centers that were down in southern Germany and some of the various troop units spread around there, as well as northern Italy, Vicenza. There was the only. So I immediately jumped on that and was begging for that assignment if I could get the Army to let me extend for a couple of years. Talked them into it, and the Army agreed. And my wife and I went down to Munich in the fall of '83. And I got to spend 2 glorious years running all. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I cannot let you say the word Vicenza without mentioning Papa Bear. Do you remember Papa Bear? He's the big sports guy that was down in Vicenza. Papa Bear? You don't remember Papa Bear? He's been there for 50 years.
Call that guy.
Yeah. You don't remember him?
I don't know.
We digress.
No, I don't. I'm not familiar.
He was like a famous guy, an American who was the Vicenza athletic director, so to speak.
I don't know how I missed that.
Yeah, I don't know. He was there for years. No, he's good. He's a very good dude. But anyway, getting back to, one thing that he's talked about was being young, right out of high school. And that was very similar to my situation. A lot of people who are get involved with the Stars and Stripes are they're young reporters. So you put a pen and a notepad in the hands of a PFC or a specialist force, and they're going toe to toe with generals. I mean, that's kind of a powerful thing. So how did you handle that? Was that a big ego trip? Because for me, it was.
I mean, it was intimidating at first. It was intimidating, but not being a big part of it was not having to wear the uniform. That made that sort of alleviated a little bit of that intimidation. And obviously, I was young, and they, the interviewees recognized that, but I don't recall any of them, trying to overpower me or you know, make me feel the superior inferior kind of thing. Yeah, but it was definitely a trip for. I was a Spec 4 at the time. That was definitely a trip. I mean, getting to cover four-star General Bernard Rogers and folks like that. And I got there. I was 21. I just turned 24. Yeah, I was a youngin' for sure.
Yeah. But to be able to have that power at that age is crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Those 2 years down in Munich, great. I got to do first-person reporting in the Oktoberfest twice, 2 years in a row. Did a whole bunch of feature traveling. I covered every Armed Forces Recreation Center Learn 2 course. They did the Learn 2 weeks. Learned to cross-country ski, downhill ski, luge. I learned to hang glide, and I got to write feature stories on all those courses. Pretty cool. And I also got to cover hard news stories because U.S. Army Europe and U.S. Air Forces Europe would hold all their official conferences down at the AFRC sites. Equal opportunity, force modernization, all that kind of stuff. So I got to do hard news too. It was great.
well, I'll tell you what, that's a tough
And
beat.
then when I was down in
Garmisch.
Munich, I also shot almost all my Garmisch, Berchtesgaden, Chiemsee.
Yeah, that's a tough beat, is what I said.
Oh yeah, a lot of my friends were quite jealous. Oh yeah, you tough down there for sure.
So
And then when I was down in Munich, I also did all my own photo shooting too. So I got to develop the photo side of my skill set as well.
cool. Cool. So again, you went to the Defense Information School, which all the journalists for the Stars and Stripes went through there. Any memories there? I mean, that's a big alumni group there of people who went through DINFOs, and what's that meant to you?
Well, I went through several of their courses. I did the basic course, the intermediate course, the advanced course was down in South Carolina. I did the basic, the advanced course, and the newspaper editor's course. So I did 3 different stints out there, and it was, it was pretty. As far as military environments, that was pretty loose, and it was a lot of fun. I mean, you get a communal thing. You kind of felt like you were in school and class and your classmates. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed going out there.
Yeah, I spent two. I went to the photojournalism school out there as well as the basics. So yeah, I spent some time out there. It was great. It was great. So, but a lot of people who went through DINFOs really feel a fraternity, or there's a brotherhood
Yeah.
about people who went through DINFOs. Whether it's in 1950 or 1980 or 1990.
It is quite a fraternity to say you've gone through DINFOS, but then when you say, "Oh yeah, I was with the Stars and Stripes," oh yeah, okay, well, you get a little jealousy.
Yeah,
I say, hey,
yeah,
can I tell you?
yeah. Can't help that I'm good. So again, I'm specifically looking at traveling in and out of Berlin and kind of what Berlin was like. So, can maybe just kind of describe, when you got orders to go to Berlin, what was the process to actually get into Berlin? I'll just kind of shut up and let you kind of talk that through.
I mean, you'll be able to edit all this, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna I'll edit all this down. Yeah, and some
Okay,
of these are just
so
for my own
I'll just
notes. These are just really
basically.
for my own notes, Chuck.
Okay. Well, I'll just basically rip through the email that I told you about what that process was all about.
Sure.
I was in West Berlin, the top of his 10-year trip to Europe, his first major trip to Europe as president, and it was again a bit of chest thumping just to show the flag and rah rah rally the NATO allies. And I got myself back to the team that was going to fly in to cover the visit, but we wanted we wanted to have wheels in the city, so I volunteered to drive a staff car across the inner German border and bleak East Germany and through the Berlin into West Berlin. And I went to checkpoint Alpha on the border between West and East Germany. That was up, and I've been told there would be small kind of nondescript buildings, one on each side of the border, and go in. This was in '82. I was still fairly new. I'd been there less than 2 years. And President Reagan was due to visit West Berlin. That was the last stop of a 10-day trip that he'd made through Europe, a bunch of stops in Europe, doing a little showing of the flag to the Warsaw Pact and rallying the NATO allies as him being the new president. And we wanted to send a team to West Berlin to cover that last stop. And we were going to fly. It was about, I think there were like I was one of 4 reporters tapped for the team, and we had a photographer, 2 photographers going too. And the rest of them were going to fly in, but we wanted to have wheels on the ground because there were a couple of different events going on around the city, some anti-American demonstrations, stuff like that. So we wanted to have some wheels on the ground. And I immediately volunteered. I was young, 23 years old, full of piss and vinegar. I thought it would be way cool to drive across the commie East Germany. So I volunteered to drive the staff car, and they wrote up travel orders for me. And I got to the checkpoint on the inter-German border. I was told there would be 2 small nondescript buildings, one on each side of the borderline, with the some fencing there. I was told, go into the first building. There'd be some American folks there, some American troops there. A master sergeant, I was told, would look over my orders, and then he would send me on to the other side. And I'd go into a small room. There'd be a door with a painted over window with a small half moon slot. They told me, stick your orders in the slot, wait for them to come back out, and then you should be good to go. So I cleared the American side with no problems, went over to the East German side, stuck my paper in the window, and I felt like, Jesus, it's taking kind of long. What's going on? All of a sudden, the door flew open, and here comes an East German border guard in what looked to me at the time like a full Nazi uniform. And he was just jabbering at me in high-speed German, which I only spoke very little. I hadn't learned much of the language yet. And he was, pointing at my orders and just kind of half screaming at me. And I'm like, holy cow, they're going to hold me off to the gulag here. But I finally managed to convey to me that there was a discrepancy in my paperwork. It was multi-page orders, 2 places on the orders for my dates of travel, and they didn't match, because my dates had changed in the week before I traveled, and the personnel office at Stripes had updated one of the dates, but not the other. So I had to go back to the American side and have them fix that. And when I went back to the master sergeant, he got really pissed at himself. And I later learned that this was a little gotcha game that they played with each other, that when the paperwork wasn't right like this. So he fixed my dates, made them match up. I went back through the process again, and everything went smoothly. I stood there for just a couple minutes. The paperwork came back out, and I was free to get in my car. I drove across East Germany. It wasn't that far. It took a couple hours maybe, and then got to the checkpoint at the border with East Germany and Berlin, which was more like it was way more elaborate than that inter-German border. It was more like a toll plaza. A bunch of lanes, and with a big overhead thing, and a bunch of fairly large buildings, and then obviously the wall stretched out from that. And I just pulled up to one of the booths there, and they looked over my paperwork. I went to the other side. My paperwork looked okay, and boom, I was proceeding into West Berlin, like wiping the sweat off my brow. I made it.
How unsettling was that? So
it was. I was pumped for the adventure, but I have to say, when that thing that happened to me at the inter-German border, that got me quite anxious, made me quite nervous. This is Cold War business here, but going through the wall, and I'm like, wow, I am in West Berlin. I just passed through the Berlin Wall. It was very, very cool feeling. Very cool for, a young reporter with stars and stripes. It was very cool.
So you were in the Army in the 80s, which is kind of in the heart of, towards the end of the Cold War was certainly in full bloom.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what did the wall mean to you? Did it have any sort of significance? You didn't grow up in a divided city.
Well, I had an interest in history, all through my youth, but the Cold War, quote unquote, the Cold War was kind of a vague, conceptual thing to me. Even when I got to Germany those first few years, it was like I just wasn't. It wasn't in the forefront of my consciousness. But when I went to Berlin and did that whole experience, going through the 2 checkpoints and going into Berlin, seeing the wall with the barbed wire and all of that, it really drove it home to me in a way that, you know, that nothing else could have. And from that point on, I was much more conscious of the quote unquote Cold War, you know, vibes that surrounded serving in the army in Europe in the 80s.
And people always focus on the wall and the graffiti and the messages, but the cold darkness of the, stockers and the barbed wire and the guards on the other side. It was a different world as soon as you crossed over into East Germany. It really was. And even when you got into
Oh,
checkpoint Alpha, you got into a bunch of nothingness for 2 hours till you got to the next
absolutely.
checkpoint.
I mean, there was that one specific route that you had to follow going across East Germany, and boy, it was bleak. I mean, it was like there was nothing. It was very barren and bleak.
Yeah, you can't
Which
stop for
kind
gas.
of
You had to have a full tank of gas. There's all kinds of regulations that
yeah,
you could
yes,
not stop.
yes, yes. And it kind of epitomized, you know, the bleakness and barrenness of it kind of epitomized to me the vague idea I had in my head of the Warsaw Pact, the Eastern Bloc. You know, this is kind of what it's about. You know, so yeah, it drove it home to me in a way that nothing else ever could have.
Would you
Having
say
that
that
experience.
you almost need to see it to
Yes,
because if you didn't had never really seen it, the Cold War maybe didn't really come into focus to you.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, being there, you know, it's the same kind of feeling I had. We went down. I did an assignment once when I was down in Munich. I went to the Dachau concentration camp
Yes, awesome.
and did a feature story on that, and it was the same kind of vibe. You know, I'd read extensively about World War II all my life.
Well, you froze again. I'm wondering if maybe this
A
might be.
shock to the system. That trip to Berlin was the same thing about, you know, the divisions between East and West at the time.
And a lot of this really came back into focus for me as I just was reviewing some old military videos, and I came across the stuff about the Berlin Wall, which back then, I mean, it was all propaganda, but there was tons of propaganda about the Red Scare, and and it was just very interesting. I'm not sure from a PR standpoint that would have flown today. They could have gotten away with some of the things that were being said and alleged.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was easier to manage whatever kind of message anybody wanted to convey. It was much easier back then because it was the pre-internet age, you know.
Yeah. It
So,
also was the
yeah,
East Germans, and they pretty much told you what they were going to say. So, uh,
yeah.
an interesting. So, and to be able to cover Ronald Reagan's visit, that had to be a big deal, because that was a visit that was actually very significant in the whole kind of chronology of the way things would go from 1982 to 1989 when the wall went down. Talk about that visit and what was all involved with that.
Well, that visit kind of set the stage for his 1987 pronouncement to Gorbachev, tear down that wall. So, you know, 82 was set the stage, but it was quite frenetic. I mean, everybody, the whole city had a vibe in it. Like, you know, everybody was juiced about this. Reagan got to Tempelhof Airport, and there were like 20,000. I mean, there were a lot of Americans there, but a lot of West Berliners too, and all waving the American and West German flags to greet him. But there were also thousands of anti-American protesters around the city, and that was part of what we knew that was going to be happening, and that was part of what we wanted to cover. Why we sent several people. We had people running around to different parts of the city, just sort of checking things out and covering what was going on. So it was a day of excitement. I mean, there was an energy vibe that just lasted all day and well into the evening.
Well,
I mean,
certainly.
you had to say you knew that history was happening before your eyes. I felt that.
Well, it's interesting because certainly John F. Kennedy went to Berlin, obviously very famous for being in Berlin, and Reagan was really the next president really to have a significant focus on Berlin. So obviously you
Right.
had a chance to see that second, and you were at the Charlottenburg Castle, correct? Is where he did his speech.
Yes. Yes.
So interesting. And one thing I think I mentioned to you is that at Checkpoint Charlie, there's a scene where Reagan, kind of makes a little trip over the line, but a reporter asks him very clearly, clear as day, and this was in 1982, Mr. President, will there ever be a unified Germany again? And he looked at the camera, just stopped, looked at the camera, was getting ready to get in his limo, and he looked at the camera and said, yes. And this was 5 years before he
Yes.
made the pronouncement. So it was very chilling. Now, you said you were
Yes.
there, you weren't necessarily like next to him, but you were at that event. And do you remember that?
I I wasn't privy to that specifically. I mean, I didn't hear that specific. I read about it later, but I
I
didn't
mean,
hear that.
were you at the checkpoint, Charlie, or you were only at Charlottesburg?
I went to the Charlottenburg Palace, and I later heard someone else told me it
Oh, okay.
happened at Checkpoint Charlie. But I got to see Checkpoint Charlie during my visit there, but not when Reagan was actually doing his thing there.
Sure. Well, that brings me to another point. What was your experience at Checkpoint Charlie? I mean, to me, I found it to be one of the most interesting places in the world. But what was your experience? Did you get a chance to like see it and check it out?
I did get a chance to see it, and again, it was it was. I have to say it was probably a little less of a jolt to my system than the inner German border crossing, because that was just the first, that was the
Yep.
first checkpoint.
Mhm.
But still, I mean, I had in my head, like you said, John F. Kennedy going to Berlin, and I had in my head, I had an interest in history. I knew the significance of it, and getting to see it was, it was one of those things I told myself, yeah, that's something you can tell the grandkids about.
Well,
For
did you get a
sure.
chance to check out the museum, the Checkpoint Museum at all?
Yes,
Which was fascinating. I
yes, I
talked to
did.
people how they escaped and everything. You really told the story about the
Oh yeah.
wall. To me, that was next
Yep.
to Dachau. That was the most chilling thing I remember seeing when I was in Germany.
Yep. Yep. Yes, you definitely had a sense that you were immersing yourself in history, for sure.
Sure, sure. Well, again, we have about five minutes. I really appreciate you keeping up with me on the technical issues and stuff like that. So, one of the common themes as I talk with Stars and Stripes people is they say, "Hey, it was the best job I ever had. I met so many people. I was able to really develop myself as a journalist." Talk about you. What did it do for you in your career?
Truly, anyway, I mean, a young guy is being able to that I have to do in for work and play. The only I didn't get to during those 5